Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the webinar in the theme Electricity Market Transformation, Challenges and Lessons Learned. And we have the speaker today, Dr. Karel Knowles, or Carl. He is a visiting professor of the Joint Graduate School of Energy and Environment, King Mongkut University of Technology, Thonburi. But his full-time position is a director of Aiden Consulting from Australia. And he will be with us at JGSCE this week until tomorrow. And he gave the lecture already 2 lectures. One is in this theme and the other one is on the environmental finance on Tuesday. You can watch the records from Facebook of JGSCE CE. And today is his final lecture for his visiting professorship to JGC this time. And his lecture will be on the topic of a global survey of electricity market transformation. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Karel Knowles.
Okay, so good morning and thank you, Khun Sunarat, and welcome to our online audience. So yes, as Khun Sunarat kindly said in the introduction, I've been a visiting professor here at JGSE since 2019. In 2019, I was the manager for energy market reform for the Northern Territory government's publicly owned electricity utility. So I've actually been in system control in a utility, trying to manage the issues of profound energy transformation. Before that, I had been variously a full-time academic. I was a director of the University of New South Wales Centre for Energy and Environmental Markets, and I spent some years, then about 8 years, working at Macquarie Bank in the utilities and climate change team at Macquarie Bank and Macquarie Capital. So I was an investment banker and I did a whole series of transactions around the space. So I have been variously an academic, an industry practitioner and an investment banker. And for the week we've just had, it's been a busy week. We had scheduled 5 lectures. The first one on challenges facing the Australian electricity markets, and then the Enviro Finance Survey. We were then going to have 2 lectures yesterday on the details of environmental finance deals. Unfortunately, I was unwell, but we have rescheduled them for July, so the opportunity will come. And then this lecture now. Originally, we had proposed today's lecture to be a case-by-case analysis looking at energy market transformation in various countries around the world. And we were well into doing that when the International Energy Agency released 3 landmark reports. So there are, if I may skip forward, so the IEA, International Energy Agency, has released these 3 reports just in the last week and a half, and they are fascinating reports. And so we decided to rejig today's lecture. Today's lecture is a bit different to the other lectures. It's really me having read these reports. I've taken from them various things that I saw in the report that I thought were interesting. There's no particular science to why I thought they were interesting. They're just things that I found relevant, and noting that the 3 reports have got a significantly different focus between them. So I've tried to find the materials in one report that sort of relate to things that have been put in the other report, and we're going to talk to some of the mixed messages that come out of this. So the 3 reports are the World Energy Investment Report 2023. So that's a generalized report looking at investment into all forms of energy production. So coal, gas, oil, nuclear, renewables, everything.
the scaling up private finance for clean energy in emerging and development countries, this middle report. This is a fascinating report for those of you that are interested in trends in middle income countries and the sorts of policies and changes that are occurring there. And then finally, the global renewable energy market update of June 23. That one actually only came out about 3 days ago. In our first lecture, if I were to summarise the 2 hours we spent talking about the Australian electricity market transformation, the summary would be that it's not going to plan. That the level of investment required to meet the stated goals is simply not happening, that there are profound challenges with grid and system stability and simply the rate at which you can integrate large amounts of renewables into a grid. And I think the core message from Monday's lecture was that, at least in the Australian electricity market context, we are not on a trajectory to meet the stated decarbonisation and transformation targets. And indeed, personally, I struggle to see how we could meet them. If I were to take the several 100 pages, each of these reports is well over 150 pages. If I were to take a single synthesized message out of reading these 3 reports, it is that on a global basis, the targets are not being met, the level of investment required is not being met, and that profound challenges exist on meeting the stated targets. So Australia is clearly not an outlier. We are, in fact, in the middle of the experience that I think is being outlined here. So there's the extremely compressed message for today's lecture. The IEA reports show that things aren't going to plan. So with that said, let's get into the detail of some of the things that are chosen. Now, as I said, I've clipped stuff from all 3 of these reports, and I've tried to reference them to which one I've taken it from. So it's a bit of a jumping process between them. So let's just move on. I'm happy on this lecture, by the way, because the nature of this material is very much putting up some interesting data and then discussing it. At least, in my case, putting forward the reaction that I had when I saw this data. Very happy to field questions that come up as we go. So feel free to put any questions you may have in the chat, and we'll try to stop and discuss as opportunity arises. So next slide, please. Okay, so I think item 1 from the Energy Review is that there are some major and profound transformational trends at play, and they are at cross purposes. So here's a quote from the Energy Review. The shock to the system from the global energy crisis has come at a time of increasingly visible impacts of changing climate. Price spikes created strong economic incentives to increase supply and find alternatives. Energy security shocks created powerful incentives to reduce vulnerabilities and dependencies, while also, for many developing countries, draining the financial resources available to finance them. So let's unpick some of the things that are in there. So the note was made that particularly during the last 18 months, we've had a significant spike in fossil fuel prices. They've started to come down again now, but there was a spike there during 22-23. And that, as we discussed on our first lecture, there are very large subsidies that are baked into the energy policy plans of many countries, where they are attempting to directly subsidise underlying energy cost to consumers. So we're talking fuel, petrol price subsidies and similar things. Those those subsidies all exploded in cost in the last 2 years. And that has put a very large hole in the budgets of many countries around the world. This is at the same time that policies have been attempting to say, look, we're going to invest into large amounts of renewables and large amounts of additional plant and large amounts of additional investment. And so the point they're making here is that you've got these three trends sort of colliding with each other, which is volatility in global energy prices, a desire to decarbonise, and the massive investments that requires, and the large impacts on budgets of attempting to manage those spiking energy prices. So again, I think this is probably one of the core takeouts from all these reports put together is that the trends are at cross purposes. Let's take a look at some numbers. So this is from the Energy Finance Report there. They refer to three policies. So stated policy scenarios, steps. So this is their projections on the basis of current existing announced policies on a global basis. And then they have two low emission scenarios, the sustainable development scenario. So this is where the UN Sustainable Development Goals are actually reached in terms of the energy related components of those sustainable development goals. And then a net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. So this is the scenario that aligns with the UN FCCC Paris Convention agreements. So again, we're going to look at the graphs in a minute, but the three policies are the policies that people have actually got, the policies that they have supposedly agreed to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is a United Nations multilateral agreement, and the policies required to meet the supposed agreement for the climate goals. Okay, let's get forward. Okay, and it looks like this. So global related CO2 emissions on the left, you can see historical up to this point and then a projection. So on current policies, the IEA is predicting steady global greenhouse emissions for the next couple of years and then a slow decline thereafter. You can see that neither of these come even close to meeting the stated policy targets for 2050, being the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the net zero emission goals. So there is an enormous gap between what the policies currently do. The other interesting thing that I noted, the red notes are my notes, the rest of it is clipped directly from the report. The underlying assumption on this one, on their actual existing policy one, is that there will be 680 gigawatts of renewables and 20 gigawatts plus of nuclear being installed every year during that scenario between now and 2050. Most of which they assume to be in China, India, and the Middle East. Okay, so some very large numbers that underline even the small decline that we're seeing in the business as usual policy. Okay, next step. In one of the other reports, however, they pointed out that investment in low emission dispatchable generation, with the exception of nuclear power, has fallen, while spending on grid infrastructure has been below the average. Now, again, those of us that work in the power sector know that the energy transformation as it's currently envisaged, which involves large amounts of low emissions generation in places that are not where existing power stations are. So these things are often located somewhere else, be it a biomass plant or a solar farm. They're located somewhere else. Grids need to be built to carry that power. So the findings that spending on grid infrastructure has been below the average would suggest that the grids are simply not being built at the required speed to bring that form of generation on. The other interesting point there, note the keywords annual investment in low emission dispatchable generation has been falling. So this is not solar and wind. Solar and wind investment has been growing very rapidly, and we'll see some data about that in a moment. What we're talking here is biomass or gas plant with carbon capture and storage, or other forms of dispatchable generation. So that will play a key role in any decarbonisation agenda in the energy sector. And again, it's a very concerning trend that that investment has been falling. Indeed, as they say, these are worrying trends, and I'd say they have that right. Okay. Okay, so let's take a look at some investment numbers. So this is taken from the that private financing private sector investment report. So we see here the historical levels of investment into in this case electricity, and then various sorts of fossil fuel generation, coal, oil, and natural gas, and then the levels of investment that are implied to meet the three scenarios that they've outlined in their report. So the business as usual scenario, so you can see that is kind of in line with the level of investment growth over the last 3 years. So that's sort of believable. But then the implications from the two low emission scenarios is that the level of growth here obviously has to, on the investment side, the amount of investment occurring every year between now and 2030, it just needs to increase massively, right? So to come back to one of the points we were making in the environmental finance lecture on Tuesday, a large amount of that additional money is going to have to be private sector investment. There simply isn't enough public sector money to do this kind of ramp up in investment in that short period of time. So we're talking a focus on the part of governments around the world about how to bring large amounts of private sector investment into the energy sector. And that is also going to be quite challenging. I do note later in today's presentation some of the interesting work that's being done by the multilateral agencies, so GEF, Global Environment Fund, IFC and National Finance Corporation, they're both World Bank Group organisations, doing some interesting blended finance things to try and facilitate the flow of private investment. I think that's pretty critical. So, okay, next slide. Okay, so again, this is from one of the other reports, but it's telling the same story, which is that investment has been increasing in the power sector investment. So looking here, you see a large ramp up between 2019 and 23 in renewables investment, pretty steady level of investment in fossil energy production, and a ramp up in grids and storage, and a ramp up in nuclear power investment. But in terms of the grids and storage, not a ramp up that is anywhere close to the level that's required. Now, on Monday, one of the points that I was making was that in the Australian context, the stated policy requirements will imply constructing something in the order of 10 to 15,000 kilometres of new high voltage transmission. That's in the Australian case, and I pointed out that they were having great difficulty actually getting those projects brought forward, partly because of the obvious problems about trying to actually plan and work out where those transmission lines should be built at all, given the difficulty of knowing where the solar and wind resource is going to be best harnessed, but also the fact that they were being stymied by the many people who are not happy about having a large transmission line built across their land. and it's become increasingly expensive to compensate people and to get their agreement to do this by paying them enough money to agree to build a transmission line. I mentioned on Monday that the rate per kilometre for a new transmission line in the Australian context has more than doubled. They were offering $200,000 a year for 20 years. I'm sorry, $200,000 per kilometre over 20 years for a landholder to accept a power line across their land. They're now offering $400,000 over 20 years per kilometre. So it's doubled the offer, and they're still getting objections. So I think this chart here, is interesting to see that there is a rise in global investment in the grid. But again, I think we can see the Australian experience writ large on a global context. That is just not happening fast enough. Okay. Again, this is just a breakdown of the graph in the previous slide where they're showing the stacked proportion of where that low emission generation is going. You'll see that that renewables has grown every year. You can see that that's the renewables part in the bar. Battery storage has grown. Interesting to see there the rapid rise in the electric vehicle side, and that sort of makes sense. We're obviously seeing a lot of discussion about the introduction of electric vehicles. One of the other comments that I would make, and this was not particularly brought out in those IEA reports, but is nonetheless a very real issue, is that the sheer quantity of rare earth minerals that are required to meet those electric vehicle targets presents some interesting challenges as well. So certainly in the Australian sector, we're seeing a great deal of interest in investing into new lithium mines and mines of all sorts. But it's not by any means obvious, I think, whether that growth is going to be able to be continued at the rate required, given the constraints that we're probably going to see on the mining side. I might do a quick check. Anything in the chat box at this point? No one has asked any questions. No, okay, that's good. Body understands me, and there isn't a problem.
Carl, may I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah. You refer to low emission fuels. Can you elaborate on that? Give us some examples.
Low emissions fuels and CCUS. So they have put together two things in that category. I notice that this is a small part of the bar. It's such a small part of the bar on the top, you barely see it. It is growing. There's a bigger bar there than it is back here. So that the CCUS in that is carbon capture and utility storage and underground storage. So I suspect that about half of this bar, this little thing up here, is actually the carbon capture side of it. There has been a series of reasonably large carbon capture projects. The low emissions fuel part, again, I haven't dug into the underlying spreadsheets on this, but my suspicion would be that we're talking there biofuels, synthetic fuels, and other similar things. I observed with interest that Porsche, the car company, did a $600 million investment about a year ago into a synthetic fuels manufacturing company. So the distinction here between biofuels and syn fuels, the concept with the synthetic fuels is that you are essentially taking carbon from some feedstock and catalytically adding hydrogen to it to produce a synthetic fuel in a straight chemical process, as opposed to doing biorefining or creating ethanol. The advantage with the synthetic fuel is that you can create a fuel to match whatever criteria you're looking for. The disadvantage is that about, at least on the financial models I've seen, about 50 to 60% of the cost of the syn fuel is the cost of the hydrogen that goes into it. So one also suspects that in that bar about low emission fuels, there's probably a bit of hydrogen by electrolysis going into synthetic fuels. But I haven't actually unpicked it. Okay. Michael Morton comments, he understands each wind turbine requires 700 kilos of rare earth minerals. Yeah, I believe that's about right. Which any analysis that I've seen in this space is talking very large numbers for all of those rare earth minerals. And there's some interesting reports that have been done by mining research groups about that. We don't cover that in this lecture, but there's certainly reason to be suspicious about the ability to ramp up in time. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this one was from the private financing for middle income countries report, looking at energy demand per capita and GDP per capita and the growth in world population. Look, again, it's one of these sort of mega trend things as to how we anticipate global economic development is going to unfold. We've obviously got some projections here. I'm not sure where the IEA got these projections, whether these are UN projections or otherwise, but they're projecting by 2035 an additional sort of 3 billion people. My understanding of that is that we're talking a population projection that peaks out somewhere around 2070. But we're clearly facing a circumstance where population is on a global basis is going to continue growing. And then the point that they're making here is that on a global basis, the economies are becoming more energy efficient, in the sense that GDP per capita is growing strongly, whilst energy demand per capita is growing, but is growing less strongly. So on average, the economies of the world are becoming more energy efficient per unit of GDP that they produce per person. That doesn't help us though from an emissions perspective, because emissions don't care about how efficiently you're creating emissions. Emissions are just emissions, and you'll see there that the projected energy demand, sorry, not projected, the actual energy demand has been growing very strongly, and I think we are expecting that to continue, partly because of the growth in population and partly because of the growth in economic activity. So again, these are historical numbers, not projections, but they are making the very important point that we often sort of take our eye off the mega trend at play here of population and economic intensity. Okay, next slide. Okay, this one comes to my previous comment about the scale of the investments required, and the fact that it's simply not believable that the public purse is going to be able to finance this up. So these again are some IEA numbers with some projections under their 2 low emission scenario cases, where they're looking at the level of finance that's coming in from the public and the private sector, and you can see that they are assuming here that the great bulk of that financing is going to be private financing. So what does that mean? Well, it means that they are assuming that there will be an ongoing global process of energy market reform, an ongoing global process of encouraging private investment into power stations, and that those parts of the world that have still got large publicly owned utilities will be essentially proceeding at pace along the attraction of private sector capital. That's the implication behind these numbers. Now, Now, I don't know enough about the market performance trajectory in every country around the world, but I do know in the countries that I have looked at that that it's not necessarily proceeding as smoothly as might be implied by these sorts of numbers. Okay. Okay, so I pointed this table out, and I realise it's a bit microscopic on your screen, but it's a fascinating table looking at IEA member countries and associate countries, and some statistics about their per capita emissions and their energy demand and such. So this is essentially a breakdown of that chart that we saw previously, and the amount of clean energy investment that's occurring as a proportion of the total energy invested. So you can see it varies all the way from 15% of clean energy investment being into 15% of total energy investment being into clean energy investment. So 15% in the case of Saudi Arabia. We're perhaps not entirely surprised about that. It's obviously a major fossil fuel petrochemical economy. Through to 68% in Bangladesh and Brazil and Chile and a couple of other places, China, Colombia. So clearly a big diversion. When we looked at that chart before, where they put the aggregate numbers together, it disguised the very high heterogeneity of the actual underlying data set. There's some interesting stats in there as well. We're not going to dwell on it too much here, but looking at Indonesia, Brazil, Russia, and Thailand. Look at Thailand in the breakout here. You'll see there clean energy investment as a proportion of total investment in Thailand sitting roughly in the middle of the bunch at about 45%. So again, for the Thai audience, some of those of you I know are working in the energy sector, you're probably not very surprised to see that number, but it is interesting, I think, to put it in the relative spectrum. Okay, skipping it. So yes, this is, I guess, the flip side of that is detailed statistics. There has been this enormous rise in investment into clean energy technology, but the future, if the future is what it is, the future is not evenly distributed. It is very much seen in certain places. China, you can see, is the standout on that. This is, of course, also in the context that they're putting lots of money into coal-fired plants and other things as well. But in absolute terms, they are certainly spending a large amount of money on clean energy. European Union, United States, Japan, and then down it comes from there. One interesting dot point on there is Indonesia with an actual reduction in clean energy investment between 2019 and 2023. Now, again, that struck me as an interesting number. I haven't dug into what is actually implied in that, because in fact I was quietly surprised to see it, because I was of the understanding that Indonesia had actually passed some relatively far-reaching innovation or stimulus packages in the clean energy sector. So yes, I was intrigued by that number from Indonesia in particular, but I have not dug into it. Okay, this chart from this one is from that private finance, the energy transition paper. This one is saying in another way what I've already said repeatedly, which is that the trend is not for success. So this one is talking about power sector emissions in particular. So some of those other numbers we're looking at a broader measure of emissions. These ones are power sector emissions in particular on a global basis. These are the three targets that have been set, the two net zero, or the net zero, and the sustainable development goal target, and the announced UNFCCC target. And again, as you can see, the trend, if anything, this is the future is there. So that's the past, this is the future. And certainly the recent trajectory is simply not consistent with achieving those targets. A matter near and dear to my heart, where is the money going, particularly the venture capital money? So they've dug out some analysis here looking at early stage startup global venture capital. Now that would be an interesting statistic to try and pull together. I don't quite know how they've done that, but let's assume that they've gone through various databases to pull it out. Interesting to see that there has in fact been a very strong growth in venture capital investment into energy tech, energy related startups. Now, some of us, myself included, that have actually been involved in energy sector startups are perhaps not feeling the love there quite as much as that graph might imply. It's certainly my experience that raising money is always hard. And that raising money in clean energy projects doesn't feel that it's become materially easier in the last few years. But you know, on a global basis, that appears to be what the stats are showing. And energy is, in fact, one of the standout areas for the VC sector. Okay. Where's that money going? So they've broken out here the sorts of areas that venture capital is investing into. The couple of standout numbers that struck me out of that, and this is so they split it here by technology area, and they've split it here for both are split for technology. This one is growth stage deals. This one is early stage deals. So the distinction there being this is where the business is busily still sitting in mum and dad's garage. So it's been established and it's probably generating a bit of revenue, but it's very early. This is at growth stage. So this is where the company has got consistent revenues and they've probably moved out of the garage and they're now in a cheap office somewhere. So you would expect that larger amounts of money are deploying for that growth stage and in the early stage, and that is indeed exactly what we see. Both of the early stage stuff has grown, as you can see here, very, very strongly. Now, again, that in a sense doesn't match my lived experience. Although I do note that there do seem to be new venture capital companies, popping up all the time, but many seem to actually struggle to being deployed. That's a story for a different day. Where are they deploying? The strongest growth that I see coming through there, mobility, so electric vehicles and similar things. Purple block, other power and grids, and renewables. And likewise over here, we've seen a drop off in the growth stage deals. Now, what does that kind of imply? It implies, at least to me, that that there's been a struggle with companies moving from their early stage innovation through to the being ready to take growth stage capital. Now, I think there's a reason for that, or at least a hint of a reason for that in what I think is my next slide. Let's step forward one, which is this one. Global R&D spending and technology prices. So the two lines at the top are spending, the bottom two are prices, in this case of solar PV modules and EV batteries. And the interesting thing to note there is that despite the increased amount of research and despite the increased amount of venture capital spending, the actual per unit prices for certain key technologies has plateaued. Right, we're not seeing the rapid drops in prices of PV modules and such that we were experiencing back in this pre sort of 2017 period. So one suspects that the fundamental technologies have been pushed as far as they're going to go in terms of transformational steps, and we're now talking incremental improvements on at least some of these core technologies. Now, of course, again, there's no shortage of companies and research that are talking about the development and introduction of entirely new technologies that will enable another significant step down. People talk about new battery technologies on a daily basis, but at least in terms of stuff that you're seeing actually coming out of factories today, we're not seeing those declines in price the way we were. Of course, the other possible interpretation of that is that the underlying price, in fact, might be declining, but we're seeing an increased demand for them, and the increased demand due to the additional solar and EV technologies is driving the prices back up. That might be an alternate interpretation. So one for some research if anyone is interested. But again, to come to the point, I suspect in terms of that VC transition process, when I saw those numbers, I went, oh, okay, well, maybe that's because a lot of the easy fruit, so to speak, has already been achieved on some of these core technologies. And so it's not as obvious for how a small startup company is going to actually achieve a commercial product with an improved outcome, at least in some of these areas. Again, that's just the gut reaction I had when I read it. I put it forward as a thought for discussion. Anything in the chat while we're here?
No.
Okay, so this is actually from one of the other of the three reports. As I said, I've sort of cherry picked between the three reports to choose different things that showed. But again, we're seeing this exact same trend. So they've calculated an overall clean energy equipment price index, and you can see prices bottomed out a couple of years ago and are on the way back up. And then average prices for selected technologies, and they've got EV batteries, storage batteries, turbines, and solar panels. And again, in every single one of those technology cases, we're seeing a plateauing of the average prices to the end consumer. So I come back to where I started this lecture, that we've got these mega trends that are sort of in conflict with each other. Many of the more bullish projections that I have seen done, and particularly from, I regret to say, some of the more enthusiastic types that sit in certain universities, those projections have been based on assumptions that the declining cost curves are in fact going to continue. And obviously, if you assume that, the result you get in an economic model is that there will be a rapid transition to what become easily the least cost options. Unfortunately for those models, I think this data is suggesting that that's actually not what we're seeing, and therefore the transition is going to cost more than many of those models have assumed. Okay. Right. So this one is looking at power company investment plans, even as levelized costs and renewables move higher. So it's basically saying people are not only spending more in absolute terms, but they're also spending to get more output. So they're buying more stuff, and the stuff they're buying is more expensive, and hence the numbers are sort of rising more so. They've split this out by a series of different companies, and they've split it out here by dollars over a megawatt hour basis. But the other interesting thing on that, and we'll come to it in a moment, the other number that struck me when I read it are these two dot points here, which they saw themselves as being sufficiently interesting to put a note on it. That's the impact of the US Industry Recovery Act. I think it's industry, isn't it? The I in that Industry Recovery Act. This is the massive stimulus program that the Biden government in the United States has put through. I come to later in this some specific analysis of that, but it is a very large and significant subsidy program. And it is materially, as you can see, materially moving those projected numbers. So that struck me as a very interesting dot point when I saw that graph. Okay, moving on. Sorry, is that backwards? Forwards. Here we go. Okay, areas of expansion. So this comes back to we did this question before about where are we seeing some of this stuff. So this one over on the left is capacity additions for hydrogen electrolysis. Speaking as an Australian, not a day goes by when I don't see the Australian government talking about how Australia is going to be a hydrogen superpower and announcements of new electrolysis plants going in, or announcements of studies and government funding for electrolysis plants to go in. And this is clearly not just an Australian phenomenon. You can see here the spike of the projections that are coming through there. This is by announced start date. So you can see here, there's 2023. So it's quite actually a small number in terms of historical stuff, but there's a lot of stuff that's been announced in terms of producing hydrogen. Now, current electrolysis technologies, as I've seen them, are talking, if you're talking producing this stuff from cheap fossil fuel fired coal, which is obviously not a terribly efficient way, terribly green way of producing hydrogen, are talking producing hydrogen from memory at the order of sort of $6 a kilogram. You get it a bit higher again if you're then looking to use solar to do it. There seems to be a lot of people out there quoting different numbers and quoting aggressive numbers about how quickly those costs will come down. I just caution there that electrolysis does, at its fundamental essence, involve breaking Coulomb bonds between hydrogen and oxygen in an atom. There's a certain minimum amount of energy that's required to do that. And you'd think that the ability to just drive down the energy efficiency of that process is ultimately going to hit some physical barriers. So I personally, not being a hydrogen expert, but just a guy who studied high school physics, I do wonder about some of these projections you hear about declining costs on clean hydrogen from electrolysis. The graph on the other side, and you'll notice the scale here. This is scaled about 3 times as big as that one. This is on the carbon capture and storage projects. So again, we're seeing a whole series of very large carbon capture and storage projects that have been announced to come on in the next 3 years. Particularly, you'll notice in there, in North America and Europe. So the takeaway from this chart for me was that carbon capture and storage is about to have something of a renaissance. It's been a bit of a quiet performer for some years, but it's clearly being seen now as coming into its own. Just going to grab a glass of water. Okay, anything in chat? No one wants to talk to me. Very good. Okay, stepping forward. All right. Yes, the other point, these again are clips from their reports. One is around the split between proposed utility scale renewables plant, and their suggestion or their note there that 2/3 of what's projected to be installed this year will be solar. So, and I've noted in the report that's both rooftop solar and utility scale solar. Again, I was slightly surprised about that. Certainly from an Australian context, they're seeing some quite significant offshore wind farm developments being proposed. And indeed, for the utility scale projects, wind farms, do have some significant advantages. The core one being the higher utilisation factor. So wind just blows more of the time than the sun shines. It's just the way of the world. So it would be interesting to unpick a little there as to what's driving that. It's not immediately obvious to me what that is. Possibly it is that it is proving easier to overcome local community opposition to putting in paddocks and fields of solar panels than it is to put in large, visually obvious wind farms. I believe that if someone said that was the reason. I note that certainly again in the Australian context, both solar farms and wind farms are now beginning to attract a significant amount of community opposition, and for different reasons in different places, but certainly large, visually imposing wind farms onshore, inside the land somewhere, have been. I don't think we've got any of those in fact coming online. Actually, we've got one in Tasmania that's coming online this year, but everything else seems to be focused around offshore wind. And they note that there in the report as well, on a global basis, onshore wind is expected to decline in 23 compared to 2022. So I think the Australian experience there is probably writ large. Despite how any of us as engineers might feel, it appears that many people don't like living underneath a wind farm. The other interesting point they made were these last 2 points about the impact of the war in Ukraine. IEA's analysis projected 40% increase in renewables deployment in Europe in 2023, 75% of which is solar. And then they made this comment: European countries introduced more policy and regulatory changes to permitting in the last 18 months than over the entire previous decade. So there's a perhaps slightly unexpected impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Okay. Again, this is some clips I've taken from various bits of those reports. So they all come to this same point that I've made here on the right, that the financing requirements are absolutely enormous. I mean, the numbers are just staggeringly large, and that the focus in terms of government policy and utility policy is going to have to be around how to attract these large amounts of private finance. So they make some points here, and again, this is quite detailed, I'm not going to read it all, but they state to meet rising energy needs in a way that align with the Paris Agreement, so that's the climate change agreement, clean energy in medium income countries will need to more than triple from US $700 billion in 2022 to 2.2 to 3 trillion per year by the early 2030s. If China is excluded, the increase is even steeper, amounting as much to as much as a seven-fold increase in annual investment. Say that one, for a fourth time, a seven-fold increase in annual investment over the next 6 years. Okay. Both private and private will required to deliver it. Where are we? There's a particular line they had here I'm looking for. Yes. Now, here's another little interesting one. For the moment, I'm quoting the IEA report, for the moment, the cost of capital for a typical utility scale solar project can be 2 to 3 times higher in key emerging economies than in advanced economies or China, reflecting real and perceived risks in the country. Now, one of the other slides that I know I've got in the deck somewhere is a very nice breakout they've done of all the different things that go into the actual levelized cost of energy for a given project in a given country. and the various, having broken that out into sovereign risk and currency risk and some of the other costs that are in there, they then provide some commentary about the role of blended finance and multilateral agencies. And for those of you that were in my Tuesday lecture, you're going, oh yeah, I remember hearing about blended finance and multilateral agencies. So they do discuss in this report the ways in which those agencies can assist reduce that levelized cost of energy. So that's coming to this point at the bottom here about how it's simply much more expensive to get in these projects in many middle-income countries than it is to do it in the West. And that comes back again to my opening comment about these three trends that are sort of in conflict. You're trying to get more stuff built at the same time that the underlying stuff you're trying to build is actually becoming more expensive. So that comes to this. So we'll talk about that when we see this this breakout slide. Okay, please. Okay, so again, this is just clips from elsewhere in their reports that talk about the same thing, talking here about the importance of concessional funds. So it's guaranteed, guarantees, subordinated debt, and various other forms of blended finance technique. Again, I'll come back to what exactly that involves when we get to that graph, which I think I've got sitting near the end. But again, the key takeout, achieving stated goals involves a 3-by increase in investment, at least, if not more. Okay, please. Okay. What have we got here? Not just in generation. So yes, so this graph from the IEA again didn't surprise me, but I thought was an interesting interesting to see the data coming forward, which is looking at the investment both in the actual generation side, so clean energy, clean power, but also then the grids, which again, for those of us that work in this field, we go, yeah, grids are the, where the action's at. It's actually where the bottleneck is. But I don't think that has sort of permeated out. But the other interesting thing to that is their note about that whilst on the generation side, we're seeing a large amount of private investment coming in. We're not seeing that on a global basis for the grids, for the infrastructure. Now, again, when you sit back and think about that, you sort of go, oh yeah, I can see why that is, because the grids are viewed as something of a natural monopoly asset. They are often publicly owned, and therefore the investment into them is made by public utilities, because there's this perception, and indeed some truth to it, that it is much easier to have a private company build a discrete localized power plant somewhere than it is to have them running a grid, which has got all the issues of third-party access and anti-competitive behaviours and such that you get with the grid infrastructure. The point, though, again, that the IEA makes is that the proposed levels of new clean energy generation simply imply a massive increase in investments in grids. And hence, unless we're expecting to see on a global basis a massive increase, like a factor of 2 or 3, on that public investment into grids, then what we're really saying, or what these reports are really saying, is we're going to see a global tidal wave of introducing private sector reform into building electricity grids. Right? And again, that's probably a reasonably confronting assumption on a global basis, because at the moment many of those grids are publicly owned in public monopoly utilities. So it remains to be seen how that plays out. Is that Bundit's hand raised from before, or is that
yes,
me?
yes, it's me. I noticed that Latin America has attracted more private investments than the public. as against others? What's happening there? What have they done?
I'm not entirely sure, but I would hazard a guess, and it is only a guess, that there's been a number of major privatisation programs that went through in Brazil under the former government. And I think we may see that may be what's impacting there. Obviously, Brazil is by far Latin America's largest single economy. So what happens in Brazil tends to be what happens in terms of the stats for Latin America as a whole. Look, I don't know that, but that would be my suspicion. I suspect it's from those privatisation programs over the last 5 years. But I'm remembering that. Comment from Michael Morton in the chat. Price plateau on solar is primarily due to handling market, and associated costs. And yeah, you'd sort of expect that, wouldn't you? Because obviously, however high the performance of an individual product is, you still have to move it, install it, maintain it, and those costs have not come down in the same way that the underlying technology costs have. And there's just, by virtue of the fact that solar farms are big things, there's always going to be a fair bit of manual handling involved on them. Again, this is one of those unfortunate realities about solar farms. But yes, I take the point, Michael, that there are lots and lots of technologies, not just on solar, but on batteries, and on all these problems, lots of technologies that people are talking about. But I think the point to make there is that when you look at the end use price to the actual utility that's putting these things in, or the consumer that's buying the car that's got the battery in it, the statistics across all of those different categories of things are showing the same plateauing effect. And I think if we're serious about this energy transformation thing, in terms of policy, we're going to have some close looks at why those are there. And you're quite right, a good fraction of it is handling costs in the case of solar, but we're going to have to look at what can be done to get those prices trajecting down again.
Michael wants to say something.
Oh, please, Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, so very interesting. So thanks very much, Carl, for the information to date. Yeah, I'm totally in agreement with all of your observations. Just adding a bit of perspective, because these are issues that we've been working on for a long time, trying to understand what's happening and so forth. And your comments around the grid were interesting, that there are fundamental issues in the grid in Australia, and I'm sure many other countries too, in terms of building out the grid fast enough. So just reflecting on a few ideas there. In China, as you probably know, they've got a substantial high voltage grid that they've built east to west. So the idea is that you can use the setting sun in the west to power the east coast, Beijing and so forth. However, the high voltage grid that they've built, I understand, is extremely complicated, involves many hundreds of engineers to maintain. And despite the fact that they've had it in place now for possibly a decade, I think, they're only able to utilize something like 1/3 of the capacity. So that doesn't look particularly promising. And we know that Sun Cable in Australia has run into problems trying to ship power up to Singapore in terms of the cost, etc. But just coming back to some of the work that we've been doing that I've spoken to you about before, and that is to sort of reinvent the battery. Well, a battery we see as a chemical device, but we've been looking closely at supercapacitors. And at the moment, one of the major issues in supercaps is that their storage capacity is limited largely by the voltage. So they only operate at somewhere between about 2 and 5 volts, maximum voltage, before they start to disintegrate. So our focus has been to look at trying to push that upper voltage limit up to the 600 to 800 voltage range, and using obviously quite a different approach to what is being done now, Now, the reason why we're looking at that so closely is that if you look at the formula for stored energy in a supercap, as you increase the voltage, the amount of power that's stored in the supercap goes up exponentially to the power of 2. So if you can push the voltage, the working voltage, up to 600 to 800 volts, you effectively substantially reduce the size of the supercaps. And we know that supercaps are long-lived. You know, you can have 2 million cycles versus, say, 2,000 cycles and so forth. But anyway, coming back to your point about the grid, because that's what we're talking about here, is that if you can move your energy storage close to where you're generating the power, so, you know, have everybody that's got rooftop solar having a supercap energy storage, then maybe the grid to some extent becomes redundant, which we'd like to see, because we just can't see the the grid scale out happening as fast as it needs to happen. And also because of the rare earth metal problems, we don't see lithium batteries and so forth as being a viable solution either. But supercaps, on the other hand, predominantly rely upon graphene and carbon-based technologies, which are quite doable and quite inexpensive to implement. So this is just a few reflections there. The other one was on the hydrogen. I think the US Department of Energy quotes $2 per kilogram of hydrogen as being the target. So we're certainly, you mentioned 6 and and 8 and so forth. So
I should have clarified there. That was 6 Aussie.
Aussie, right? Okay, yeah, we're still certainly a long way from achieving that goal. We actually in Australia have done some research with hydrogen, generating hydrogen using an electrolyzer. And we mix that with a ratio of petroleum-based fuels, mainly LPG, and we discovered that most of the existing combustion engines can work quite comfortably using about a 40% hydrogen component as a part of the mix. So there's a huge opportunity there, for example, for companies like APA in Australia, that own about 80% of the gas grid, to put solar panels over the top of their gas lines, generate the hydrogen as the natural gas transits the network, and feed the hydrogen into the pipeline, so that they're increasing the value of the gas that from the time that it leaves the upstream to the time it reaches the target markets. But anyway, I've jumped around a bit there, but just hopefully that adds a little bit more depth to some of the things that you've been mentioning there.
So look, I think one of the joys of webinars like this is the ability to have the discussion go in all sorts of directions, and I'm very happy and encourage anyone who's got a comment they'd like to make during these lectures to do so, particularly today's one, which is somewhat like Michael. I'm sort of just discussing my reactions to seeing these things. So let me react to Michael's reaction on that. I'm no expert around supercapacitors. I do know that I've been hearing discussions about the supercapacitor as a energy storage device. Certainly back in my Macquarie days, it was, we routinely had people coming and discussing the potentials, and I think the potentials are very real. The issue at play here, I think, is that the targets which have been set are 2030 targets. 2030 is only 6 years away. So insofar as people are serious about meeting those targets, we're really talking about them meeting them using technologies that are commercial and off the shelf today. And I think if there's one message that I sort of take out of these entire packs of stuff, is that really that's just not going to happen. In the levels of investment that are required, and Michael mentioned the China high voltage grid. Don't know a great deal about that particular project. I do know on a project that I did work on, which was what we referred to as Project Green Grid. And this again is like 10 years ago. And that project was to build a high voltage transmission line from South Australia up through Western New South Wales to unlock a set of solar farms and wind sites When we did our detailed modelling, we simply found that because of the variability on that, the utilisation rates we would get on those grid components was simply much lower than the utilisation that you required to make the thing economically stack up. And that utilisation rate on the grid flows pretty well straight through your financial model to the bottom line. The point that Michael made there around if more houses and more distributed plant have got more storage on them, it either obviates the need for the grid either completely or enables you to use the grid in a more efficient manner. Mathematically, that is certainly true, and I think it's one of the great hopes about the use of storage distributed through grids, is that it actually lets you use your existing infrastructure much more efficiently. It lets you get those utilisation rates up on the assumption that you've got the appropriate control technologies sitting in all those household inverters and battery packs and things. And again, I might add that's by no means a given. Again, in my time in Darwin, when I was working in system control, we were doing a lot of work there trying to find inverters that could meet the required brand new and emerging standards about vehicle to grid and household to grid inverter standards. Again, there's an enormous amount of work being done to create these standards and to develop the required control systems, but it's by no means a solved problem. So, you know, again, in terms of hitting a 2030 target, you know, I sort of look at all those levels of innovation that need to occur, the technology innovation, the venture capital that has to be deployed, the growth capital that has to be deployed, bringing these new technologies through, getting those cost curves down. You know, it just feels to me a very difficult ask by 2030. So it's not that far away. All right, any other comments there? Oh, sorry.
I just thought that if we can finish the presentation.
Time is passing. How am I going for time?
It's 11:12, but I don't know if you want to.
Okay, so Kunsunarat correctly points out that I am an enthusiast in this space and I will talk forever. And I should finish my presentation. So look, Michael, if your hand is up, I can't see if your hand is up, but don't worry, we won't forget you. I'll come back to you. Is there anything else in there that we should deal with? Anything else in that chat? No? Okay, look, let's roll on then. I don't think I've actually got that many more slides. Okay. Right. This was the core point of this clip is actually the very last sentence. Creating a clear risk of new dividing lines in global energy and climate affairs. Again, this is a geopolitical energy comment, and to be honest, one that I hadn't thought about until I read this. But I can now see, now that I have thought about it, I can see the point they're making. So the comment they're making here is that there is an enormous upswing occurring in financing in the developed economies, so US, EU, arguably Australia, China, and then what we're seeing in, at least in terms of the macro statistics that have come up here in all the other middle income countries put together. And again, that finance report, this is all coming from the that private finance in middle income countries report. It is a fascinating report as to why it comes to this graph we're about to get to, where we unpick the components that go into levelized cost of energy. But yes, I think it's very interesting to raise this point about are we creating essentially a new global energy poor in having set these targets and having set these targets in the way that they're being set and implemented. Are we actually creating a new sort of energy dividing line that's in there? again, I hadn't particularly thought about that, but when they raised it, I can see that it's a matter for some discussion. Okay, moving on. Right, I mentioned a few slides back, there was a graph showing the impact of the US Inflation Reduction Act. Sorry, I was going to call it Industry Restoration Act. That was wrong. Inflation Reduction Act, probably a somewhat misnamed act. It's hard for me as an economist to imagine how you push this much money into an economy and reduce inflation. But they've broken out in this IEA report the various places that act is impacting. So the yellow bars are various incentives and tax credits that the US government already had on that sector, and the green is the additional stuff coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act. So as you can see, in almost every technology category, it's a substantial increase, and in some technology categories, it's 100%, of the increase. So you can see up here that industrial carbon capture and storage. So the incentives at play have been almost doubled. We're now peaking at about 75% of the installed cost of the technology. So you marry this with the graph we saw before about how there's this big upswing in industrial scale carbon capture and storage projects that we're expecting to see in the United States. That would be why these things are being subsidized by the US government to a very considerable degree. Likewise, low emission hydrogen electrolysis, again, subsidy levels sitting up at about 58%. And then, and so on, it works from there. So we're talking very significant subsidies and very significant new subsidies on a global basis. Note a couple that particularly struck me out of that. Sustainable aviation fuel, there's been quite an intentional step up on that. And on the this one, subsidising towards used EV purchases. So 20% subsidy on when you sell your electric vehicle to a new buyer, which I thought was interesting as well. So look, overall, that Inflation Reduction Act, it's clearly a transformational act on a global basis. Again, it's not an area that I've had reason to look at closely in recent times, but I have been observing with interest some of the discussion from the EU about, well, we need to get our own programs in place to counter this. And I have heard various people that I know in the startup community saying, oh, look, this US IRA is going to cause us to want to base operations out of the States. And I can having seen this, I can sort of understand why. Okay, let's move on. Okay, this one comes to the point around the supply chains that are going into these clean energy manufacturing things. They point out here that that we're expecting to see a substantial majority, both a majority now, a very substantial majority, and a majority way into the future of lithium-ion battery manufacturing capacity being in China. Note the rapid ramp-ups in the US, and again, if we were to look back at the previous slide where we saw the subsidy levels going from the IRA into battery manufacturing, that's presumably what's driving this ramp-up in the US. And the EU is clearly doing similar things. So we're looking at a very substantial ramp-up there. And then capital expenditure on the part of major mining companies, well, yes, the expenditure on bringing new resources to market is increasing. It's certainly going up, but it's not going up at the same sort of growth rates that you see on the other side. Now, again, this is a specialist area, the question of mining research, and I'm not a mining research expert by any means. I've read a few research pieces written by others, but I think this IEA report is highlighting the same risk that we see discussed elsewhere, that it's just not obvious, it's not a given that those resources are going to be coming online at the required times. Okay. Now, on our Monday lecture, I mentioned that one of the things we've seen in Australia is essentially a complete shutdown of major new renewables projects coming to financial close in the last quarter. And in fact, I think in his recent speech at it was Energy Week or some such event, the CEO of the Australian Energy Market Operator made the same point. That there's basically been no new plants come to financial closure in the last quarter in Australia, and the reason for that has been a mix of permitting issues. So we're not just talking local council planning; we're talking permitting from the grid operators to allow connection of your plant into the grid. Now, again, this is a matter near and dear to my heart because in my time working for the NT government in power and water, trying to come up with an improved way of doing the engineering studies and the permitting process to actually connect solar farms into the grid was actually, part of my job, and a part of my job that caused me to rip out, a fair bit of hair. It's actually not easy getting these things through, because as the grid becomes more and more congested, and remember we're talking variable renewable energy, so it's putting congestion into the grid at certain very specific times, it becomes harder and harder to work out how you're going to manage that the stability of that grid. And again, I come back to the lecture on Monday, where we presented some graphs and things that have been prepared by EMO, the market operator in Australia, about how the system as a whole was becoming more unstable and the difficulties of actually trying to maintain good stability as you had more and more of this stuff in there. So this is really just showing that this is not a Australian unique phenomena. It is happening across the world. So it's not clear in this IEA analysis whether they are talking about permitting, meaning the connection of the grid connection process, or they're talking more generally about people not wanting to have solar farms and wind farms in their backyard and the permitting process for that. But nonetheless, in one sense, I wasn't surprised to see this graph. I was a bit surprised at the sheer scale of it, at the amount of capacity that was actually under construction and awaiting. It's quite a large number. You can see there it's like 4 or 5 times the actual in operation capacity. So it is a large number. I wasn't surprised that there was a lot sitting in permitting. I was surprised by the scale of it. The other point to make in there, and again in the context of the 2030 target, 2030 being 7 years away, is at the moment the average permitting time to actually get these things done is sitting out at like 4 to 6 years. So if you start the process of wanting to build a shiny new plant today, you might just get it in before the 2030 target hits us. Okay. Again, this is another graph that I provided coming back to their discussions about grid investment. And they make the very gentle observation that it could pose a significant obstacle to the clean energy transition. I don't think there's any could about that. It does, it is, and it will. Yeah, so they've just made the point there again, as they have countless the other times in their report, that there's a substantial gap between the actual investment in the grid and what is required. Okay, let's go on. Okay, this is actually a really nicely done little graph, I thought. This is out of that private financing report, and I think this is one that you know, would be very useful to work through in government policy offices that are wanting to work out how to actually bring projects to fruition. So what they've done here is they've taken the levelized cost of energy for the given technology. So, you know, you might say, look, the best available, the best case LCOE for a solar farm is, in this, you know, example, I think $70. And then the actual LCOE in the country that I'm working in is higher than that, and it's higher than that because of the following risks: political risk, sovereign risk, currency risk, transfer risk. Transfer risk being the chance that you know, someone comes and just takes it off you. Off-taker risk, if you're a private investor in a solar farm and all your output is being sold to the government-owned, electricity company, what are the chances that the off-taker, because they're your only buyer, if they decide that they want to unilaterally change the terms or something, well, you've got very little place to go. You can't pick your solar farm up and move it. So that's the off-taker risk. Bankability of the PPA. How credible actually is the organisation that's writing the PPA on the other side of you? You know, it's one thing if your PPA is written against you know, a major US government entity. It's a different thing if you're dealing in a small African country where you think there might actually be issues of sovereign default in and of itself, let alone any PPA that's been signed by the local utility. Actually getting ownership of the land, obviously, again, plenty of places around the world, when you actually try and build one of these things, you discover that it's not entirely clear who owns the land and how they do it. I actually had an experience like this, so I won't name the country, but a country in Southeast Asia, where we as Macquarie were looking at doing a biodiversity deal, and this is quite some time ago. And that particular deal involved preserving an area of rainforest, and we thought we had a deal with the local government. And then suddenly out of nowhere, the military governor of that area rolled up into our office and sat down and said, no, don't deal with them. You've got to deal with me. I'm actually the person in charge here. And we said, okay, well, you know, you've got a gun, so we'll take you rather seriously. And then not long after that, the national government agency turned up and said, no, forget about the military guys. It's actually us. So we found ourselves having three different groups who all claimed that they were the owners of the land. It's this sort of risk that is happening here. And then issues around actually implementing the technology itself when you're out in the field and you're possibly working in a country that doesn't have a well-established infrastructure. And so that all stacks up to give you the target, the actual genuine target levelized cost of energy in the country that you're actually working in. And then they've outlined a series of things that governments and supported by multilateral agencies can actually do to get that levelized cost of energy back down. So they've talked about policies such as having a government providing some assistance on acquiring the land, providing revenues in hard currency. So in other words, providing government guarantees that if you're working in a local currency, that you will, in fact, when that time comes, be able to extract your currency out. Various sorts of guarantees, which can be done in conjunction with credit export agencies or various multilateral agencies. So again, this is World Bank spends a lot of its time doing these sorts of guarantee contracts. So yeah, look, I just point out, I guess, to the audience. These sections of that report, there's both that chart and its accompanying provisions about all the different sorts of policies that can be applied. And then a particular example over here in the case of Argentina, where they've implemented a series of those, where they've written the PPA tariffs in US dollars. They've provided a currency swap conversion guarantee. They've got provisions that ensure that the bankers involved on the project actually have to be told before someone unilaterally changes any contract terms. And various other reasons. So I think I point this one out really for anyone who's in the audience who is sitting in a policy role about the sort of things that you can do as a government to actually facilitate this enormous flow in private financing that's required. It's actually quite a nice little summary in the document of those steps. I thought that was actually one of the nicest representations of it that I've seen. Okay. I think this is my last slide. This one is actually coming back to the point that I made on the Tuesday, in fact, the Monday and the Tuesday lecture, which is that one of the surprising outcomes in the Australian case has been around the sheer amount of money that is being moved directly from government to energy consumers as outright subsidies. And I pointed out in that case the somewhat surprising result of the coal price cap, 125 Aussie dollar a tonne coal price cap that the federal government announced, and they were then somewhat taken aback to discover that the groups that they had to pay that coal tax subsidy to were the groups who burned coal, which is to say coal-fired power stations. And as a result, they actually ended up passing out almost $1 billion directly to coal-fired power stations, which caused them to have some political pain as to why they were subsidising coal-fired power stations. Classic case, I think, of not having fully thought through the impact of the policies. So this chart from the IEA is really just riffing on the same point, which is that with the rise in energy or oil costs that we saw in 2022, arguably due to the Russia-Ukraine war, it has actually caused an enormous increase in the subsidies that are being paid out, because the subsidies are tacked or are linked to the cost of the underlying oil, gas, or coal, as the cost may be. And you can see on a global basis over here that over $1 trillion, over $1 trillion US dollars was spent in 2022 on subsidies, respectively, for oil, electricity, oil, and gas, and a little bit on coal. Given the size of that, it looks small, but it's actually big. I just note here that not only are those subsidies, have they grown enormously, but they are also a very large component of the share of GDP in some of these countries. So you can see here, for example, in India and Saudi Arabia, Iran have unexpectedly, right, these subsidies are consuming a very substantial proportion of their GDP budget. And to come back to one of the points that was made elsewhere in the report about this concept of creating a global energy divide, these sorts of policies would seem to be actually making that problem worse. So I think that's my last slide. Do I have? Yes. So last slide. So look, I invite at that point any further comment that comes through. Michael, US IRA limits incentives to US-based entities. Yes, indeed. Which is why, as I said, some of the groups I've spoken to have said, yes, we're going to, relocate ourselves to the States. The other, I think, classic example in there was some rapid lobbying by Hyundai around the fact that they were actually exporting a lot of batteries out of their plant in South Korea to the US to put into US assembled Hyundais, and saying, well, why aren't we able to be under this where, we're an American company and such, and they've been going through the process. So yes, I take Michael's point there that you create these subsidies and they do force significant movement in terms of where people base their operations, and indeed I think explicitly intended to in that case. Okay, any other comments or chat through the So the subsidies slide.
They are single. My question would be like, if include the rate infrastructure on that house.
Look, I don't know if they have in this. I mean, the numbers they're quoting here are conceptual. They're not intended, I think, to be a specific example. As a general thing, if you're talking about what's the LCOE for a particular generation plant, then you do it on a standalone case bubble around that plant rather than including everything. But that said, that's obviously not necessarily appropriate if, in order to get that plant to work at all, you have to build a heap of new generation. Of course, we see this discussion all the time when people say, "Oh yes, look, you know, large scale solar in the Australian outback is the cheapest form of energy." Well, they've got that number because they haven't stuck into it the amount of money that's going to have to be spent to build the transmission lines. So yes, look, I don't know if that's included it or not, but probably not would be my suspicion.
So, with that picture, the green color is like the risk premium if the government do them.
Yes, so that's you'd always expect that there's going to be some other factors that make working in a relatively less developed country more expensive than working in a more developed one. And you can't deal with all of those, and that I think is what the grey block is meant.
After we get back to more again. Actually, it's a waiting time. Okay. You make anything for the long waiting time. For the commission. That's fine.
I'm sure the
There's a lot of investment in the process. That is what they find. And there's a lot of investment for in the generation. The reason behind for those waiting time, is there anything that the grid is not available or not ready for use?
Yeah, okay. So again, this particular graph did not make clear what sort of permits they were talking about, whether this is general planning permits or other things. Certainly in the Australian case, and certainly in the cases where I've actually been personally involved, the issue is to get the permit to connect to the grid, you have to have agreement with the grid that your connection isn't going to destabilize the grid. And as the grid gets more and more utilised, particularly utilised with highly variable stuff, then it becomes harder and harder for the grid operator to be able to sign off to say, yes, if you build your solar farm there, I can successfully connect you. And I suspect that is certainly what is stopping the financial close of projects in Australia. The permitting there is the can I connect to the grid, as opposed to the can I overcome the local community opposition to my boutique and beautiful massive wind farm. Whether that's what's at play up here, I just don't know. I would comment to the question about the permitting process on that. Different places do it different ways, but developers can actually get quite a substantial distance down the way of building their thing whilst awaiting connection permit. Okay. It just is that they're taking the risk that they might get fully built and be there with their cable ready to plug in and not be able to. Again, it's not clear on this what that is. Given those times, I would have to suspect that it's also other things like general community planning stuff. It doesn't normally take the grid guys 3 or 4 years to work out that they can connect you. They can do that fairly quickly. Okay. Okay, Michael, I think, is that your hand up again, or was that from before?
No, that's my hand up again.
Okay,
So
please,
just
go ahead.
Just a thought on, so just a thought on that. I'm totally frustrated like yourself on the permitting times, and I think it's going to be a real barrier to achieving the Paris Agreement targets. And that affects us all, of course. I mean, this climate change problem is huge. It's serious, and I've just been outside talking to a guy who's come to repair the aircon, and the room I'm standing in now was covered almost to the ceiling in water just less than 12 months ago. So I'm personally a witness to the effects of climate change. It's really serious, and places like Bangladesh, it's going to create one of the biggest refugee problems that the globe has ever seen. But coming back to the permitting issue, I think there's potentially another solution here that I don't really see discussed very often, and that is, if you can't get your permit to connect to the grid, there's an option there to convert your generated power to a liquid fuel or hydrogen, and then transport that fuel into the place where it's going to be used. So, which could be on grid, off grid, multiple uses. In fact, even aircraft, I believe, are looking at now switching across to hydrogen fuel, as well as battery solutions. And again, that's where the supercaps would come in handy. But permitting, huge problem. So total agreement. So sorry for the interruption. Hope that adds some value.
Always a pleasure. And look, the point you make about using your power and having to plug it into the grid as not being the only option is actually again a valid one. So I've actually looked at, we haven't proceeded with, but we have looked at projects that involve biofuel projects in remote areas of Australia where the specific intention is to use large amounts of cheap land with lots of sunlight to produce something that might be a precursor to feedstock to a aviation fuel. Now, again, that project didn't proceed for various reasons, but yes, your point is quite right. I mean, there are other things you can do, and you'd like to think that it would be possible to make some of those things in a packaged plant of some sort. You can load onto the back of a truck in a shipping container, take to the place where you happen to have a stranded solar farm, and put that power to work. You'd like to think that would be doable. So yeah, I take the point. All right, no other comments, Sarah?
My question would be like, if it's the price of the renewable energy based on the LCO is paid like reaching the same price compared to the situation that the natural gas or the fossil fuel is very patchy. Some sort of the scenario that already like fixed in mind that within this price range, it's not going to be like the user anything, right? It's going to be like it decreased or dropped by until this price is rather fixed. If a country would take the assumption that within cost of the RE investment, you have to bear it comparing to the scenario that you have to deal with all the fluctuation due to the natural gas or the fossil fuel. So, my question would be that even with this employing of the LCOE, it's still a rush to the RE investment and the net zero or the carbon neutrality for each country.
Okay, so let me paraphrase that question about making optimal investment decisions, looking at the underlying volatility of what the various different feedstocks and energy sources might be. And I think the point Kunanisa is making is that it may well be perfectly rational to look at the volatility in wholesale gas prices and say, look, on a reasonable risk-adjusted basis, it is a better economic choice for me to invest into a solar farm than it is into a LPG or LNG powered gas plant. And that may well be the case. Okay. The issue here, however, comes back to these three, policy drivers that I mentioned right at the start that are in conflict with each other. And that is that we're working on the assumption here that we are wanting to provide increased availability of energy to an increased global population with reduced greenhouse emissions. And if the underlying costs of your technologies are not decreasing in price or are in fact getting more, then that means that not only do you want more of it, but you're paying more for each unit of it that you get. Okay, so the real point of these things, these graphs, is not that their competitive position vis an investment in a fossil fuel plant is challenged. The real point of these graphs is the overall total quantum of money that you have to spend to achieve energy services to your population, however you do it, is in fact not getting cheaper the way you had hoped it was going to. Yeah, so yes, it's a different lens of the same thing. But yes, you're quite right. It's quite possible that you would say, look, for national security reasons, for example, you might say, look, I control my own supply of sunlight, but I don't control my supply of LNG. And if I'm going, and that's obviously what the Europeans have to some extent said. They mentioned in this report that the Europeans have rammed through a heap of incentives and policy changes to bring forward renewable energy in response to the war in Ukraine. And one presumes what they're really saying is we trust the availability of our own wind and solar more than we trust the availability of Russian gas. And, who's to argue? All right. If there are no further questions online, then look, I'll make a closing comment before we close out, which is again, thank you to the JGSE for inviting me up to Thailand. Again, it is always a pleasure to come up and give these hopefully contentious and thought-provoking lectures. I've been, as I said, I've been coming up here since 2019, and it's been just in those few years the things we've been talking about have moved, considerably. I do understand that the slides, as well as an edited version of these presentations, will be made available online. It's not been made clear to me what the nature of that editing is. I presume they're going to take out my ums and ahs, not put a beautification lens on me or rabbit ears or any of those Facebook kind of lenses and things. But whatever it is they're going to do, that is going to be up hopefully next week at some point. And again, I'm sure that an appropriate announcement will be made. So with that said, again, thank you to the JGSE for hosting me. And I look forward to presenting the last two lectures, the two that we had intended to do yesterday on the detail of the task force for nature-related financial disclosure, TNFD, and the lecture where we were going to do a set of case studies about specific enviro finance transactions, particularly some around blue carbon and such. We will be rescheduling those in July, and I won't be doing it from here in Thailand, but we will try and make it a positive experience nonetheless. So with that said from me, Sarah?
So just for your information, now if you would like to watch the record, you can watch it via the Facebook page of the JGSEECE. Yeah, it's already live. And for the records and PowerPoints, you will find it on the JGSEE website, maybe in about a week. Yes. And okay, so before I close, I would like to thanks again our speaker, Dr. Carl Knowles. And again, if you have something to talk with him, you can contact him directly, or you can contact via JGSEE. Yeah. Maybe through the email that send you all the registration details, so we can connect to him. And yes, thank you for the audience, both online and on site. So I'm pretty sure that you can get a lot of useful information, yeah, for your work or something, or your studies. Okay, so so now I would like to close the webinars, and hopefully see you again in the next event. Thank you very much. สวัสดีค่ะ